Okay, so welcome back. We're happy to have you all here for our keynote address. And we're really, really pleased to have Marion Nestle here. And I don't know if Marion can hear me. Doesn't look like it.
She should be able to.
Marion, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. It's my great pleasure to welcome Marion Nestle to Science Rock virtually, but still here. We since ThinkFOOD started, ThinkFOOD 1, we wanted Marion Nestle, and we couldn't get her, but we're happy to have her now. And as you may have read in the bio that you saw, she is Emerita Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University. She chaired that department for 15 years. She has a PhD in molecular biology and an MPH in public health nutrition from UC Berkeley. She's an important, active, and prominent voice, and by that I mean loud in a good way, voice in public health and her sensible assessments of nutrition. She always cuts to the chase and she tells it like it is, and that's why we like her so much. She's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 15 books aimed at demystifying nutrition, debunking myths, and making sense of food, especially where food and politics overlap. Dr. Nestle is working on an updated and thoroughly revised edition of her now classic 2006 book, What to Eat. It's going to be called What to Eat Now, and that should come out next year, September 2025. But she still writes almost daily on her blog. It's called Food Politics. So I recommend you look at that if you don't already. There's a lot to admire about Marion Nestle. I think everyone in this room cares a lot about food, but I think Marion might just care a little bit more. An article she published in 2021 was called Public Health Nutrition Deserves More Attention. I think that's what we're going to do here now in part. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Marion Nestle and her talk, Food Politics 2024, From Agriculture to Public Health. So welcome.
Am I on?
Yeah.
I'm on. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could be there with you in person rather than in this peculiar virtual way of doing things, but this is the new normal. What can I say? I'm going to be talking to you today about food politics, and it's quite a week to be doing that, I have to say, because just a couple of days ago, The Lancet came out with a big report on the prevalence of overweight and obesity among people in the United States. And the report says that 3/4 of American adults are overweight or obese, putting us at, putting the great majority of us at risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, overall mortality, and the like. So we're not a very healthy population. And that's just 2 days ago. And that brings to attention the idea that food is medicine it's never been more badly needed. And the intersection of food and healthcare, never more badly needed. We need a healthcare system in this country, but we also need a much better food system. And I was interested to see this graph or this pyramid of the current food is medicine idea. And it shows medically tailored meals and groceries at the top of the pyramid. And then those are not particularly political. But at the bottom of the current food is medicine pyramid, we've got federal food programs, WIC, SNAP, and school food, and population-wide federal and state food policies. Nothing could be more political. And we're seeing that in President-elect Trump's appointment of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services. And I was riveted by President-elect Trump's statement about why he appointed him. For too long, Americans have been crushed by the industrial food complex and drug companies who have engaged in deception, misinformation, and disinformation when it comes to public health. Wait a minute, those are the kinds of things that I say. Industrial food complex? I could hardly believe this. And then to look at what Secretary-elect Kennedy is saying is absolutely extraordinary. President Trump told him to end chronic disease and to go wild on food. And Kennedy's idea about going wild on food is to get rid of what he considers to be poisons in the food supply. And these include ultra-processed foods in schools, artificial colors in cereals, chemicals, pollutants, and pesticides in land, sea, and air and food, mercury in fish. He's mentioned that specifically in fast food. He wants to examine the idea of restricting sodas on Snap, and he wants to end conflicts of interest in government. Wait a minute, where have I heard all that before? Incredible. Okay, there are a few things he says that are not on my list of high items, and that is he wants to get rid of grains for kids, seed oils, and fluoride in drinking water. Not very good ideas. He wants to deregulate raw milk. Not so excited about that. And he wants to fire all nutrition scientists on day one. How does he think he's going to get his agenda moved forward if he does that? And the New York Times today, in a very, very long article, talked about how Kennedy is taking on the food system. And what's that about? Trump, in his first term in office, was not famous for taking on industries, and taking on the food industry is taking on a lot. So either Kennedy is incredibly courageous or he really doesn't know what he's up against. We'll find out. We don't know, but we'll find out. Anyway, that's food politics for you. I write books about food politics, so I couldn't be more riveted by what's going on right now. But I need to say something, digress slightly. My last book was a memoir. It was my pandemic project. And I wrote it because I couldn't do any of the usual kinds of research that I do to respond to the kinds of personal questions I get asked all the time about how and why I do what I do. And I think by the time I ended up doing it, I thought it illustrated some pretty interesting themes that might be of more general interest: the importance of childhood and what happens to you when you're an adult, what it's like to be a woman in science, how you overcome barriers, particularly if you're a woman, value of persistence, and of holding values to begin with. And the first question I got asked when the memoir came out was, what's the difference between a memoir and biography? And this cartoon came out just in time. A biography is facts. It's fact checks, and it's got dates and times. And a memoir is how you feel about what happened. It's really quite different. And actually, as I keep saying, what I really do is write books about food politics. And when my book titled Food Politics came out in 2002, and then again in 2007 and 2013, the question that I got asked was, what on earth does food have to do with politics? I hope I've already answered that question for you. But I think, a more serious question, a more serious answer is useful, that food is very personal. It's how it tastes. It's how it brings you pleasure. It's your cultural tradition. It's your identity. It's just all kinds of things that have to do with who you are and what you like. But it's also extremely political because food has to do with social status, with wealth, with power, and very much with government, as we've just seen. So, I'm interested in all of these things. And I think before we go any further, I want to get my opinion about diet out on the table right away. People are very confused about what to eat. And I think that's too bad, because to me, it is what to eat is so simple that the journalist Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And all you have to do is do a little defining of what's meant by food, and you've got it. It's really this simple. But if it seems more complicated, it's because of everything else that goes on around food. And I'm fascinated that when I go online and type in what affects our choice of food, I get diagrams like this. that lifestyle and cost and health and trends and skills and region and culture and personal choice, religious and moral beliefs come up. Um, and and nowhere on that diagram is what I consider to be the elephant in the room, which is the food industry, as if the food industry has nothing to do with what we eat or what our food choices are. And so my work has been, in essence, on rebalancing the discussion and trying to give more weight to what the food industry is doing, because I think that its influence on what we eat is often enormously ignored. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, what I mean by food industry is the handful of corporations, not that many of them, that make all of the foods that we see in the supermarket, basically are responsible for supermarket food offerings. And it's not a very large group of companies, but they make a very large number of products. And I, the point that I want to make about food companies is that they're businesses. They're not social service agencies. They're not public health agencies. They're businesses with stockholders to please. And in the United States in 2024, if you are a business, not only your primary fiduciary responsibility is to your stockholders, but it is your only responsibility. Your job, starting in the early 1980s, when we had the shareholder value movement and everybody bought into it. Starting before then, corporations cared about their workers, paid their workers reasonable amounts of money, and were very concerned about supporting their communities and the people who worked for them. Starting in the early 1980s, with a speech by Jack Welch, who was then the head of General Electric, the only responsibility that a company has is to maximize profits. And once you understand that, and once you get that, a lot of what companies do makes perfect sense. And Michelle Simon has written about this in her book, Appetite for Profit, quite a while ago. And in her book, she describes the pressures on food companies from advocates like me who want them to behave better, from regulators who want to regulate them, for lawyers who want to sue them, for stockholders who just want more money faster. Food companies responded to these pressures by doing nothing, by going through all the stages of death and denial, and denying that they had anything to do with public health. And then they began to reformulate and change their products and then fight back. And it's really the fighting back that I want to talk about, because in fighting back against these kinds of pressure, food companies behave just like cigarette companies used to and still do. Now, food is not cigarettes. Cigarettes, one product, one message, don't smoke. Obviously, food is much more complicated. We all have to eat. But the food industry has adopted the tobacco industry's playbook in line and letter. And this playbook involves, first of all, casting doubt on any kind of unfavorable science, blaming individuals for what they eat, personal responsibility, saying, don't regulate us, we can regulate ourselves, creating front groups, patient advocacy groups, and other kinds of groups that will forward their message, supporting favorable research, funding favorable research, insisting on having a seat at the policy table, and when all that fails, lobbying and litigating. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about here. And just to emphasize what the tobacco industry did, they denied, challenged, obscured, undermined, lobbied, and complicated, and lied. And we know what happened with all of that. And I'll just give some examples, some recent examples. The Guardian has had a series of articles about Novo Nordisk, which is the company that makes the new GLP-1 obesity drugs. And one of its articles last year pointed out that they had made 3,500 payments worth nearly 22 million pounds to obesity charities, the National Health Service, doctors, health educators, and lobbyists in the United Kingdom in order to push those drugs forward. They did the same thing in the United States. $26 million between 2013 and 2022 for speakers' fees, food and beverage, travel and lodging, and consulting fees to doctors in the United States to ease the acceptance and the prescription of the GLP-1 drugs. Now, the GLP-1 drugs may be the answer to obesity. I think the jury is still out. We'll find out in due course. But they spend a lot of money trying to ease the acceptance of those drugs. Food companies also fund research, and there are a million examples. I post one on my blog every Monday, usually. But here's one: a study called "The Effect of Cocoa Flavanol Supplementation on Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease," and it concludes that cocoa flavanol supplementation reduces cardiovascular death by 27%. Guess who paid for that study? Mars, which makes cocoa flavanol supplements, not coincidentally. Or here's a study of the studies that found that a study is 21 times more likely to find unfavorable results about the Nutri-Score method of front of package labeling in Europe, which sort of grades products by how healthy they are. If the author had a conflict of interest or if the study was funded by the food industry, it was 21 times more likely to show that Nutri-Score didn't work very well or was a useless way of evaluating products. So that's the food industry in action, the playbook in action, and the playbook applies to the tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical drug industry, the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, and very much to the food and beverage industry, as I will continue to show. So with that background, let's take a look at what I think are the three most important global public health problems in 2024. And these are hunger and food insecurity. Billions of people in the world don't have enough food to eat and don't have enough of the right kind of food to eat on a daily basis. The second one is obesity and non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases. These are people who are eating too much of the wrong kind of food, and the environmental effects of the way we produce and consume food. And then we still are dealing with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what's interesting about this is how interrelated these are and how all of them are aspects of dysfunctional food systems. Dysfunctional food systems are among the root causes of all of these. So let me say something, first of all, about food systems, just to review. By food system, I mean how we grow, process, distribute, get, make, and throw away foods. And the idea of food systems thinking is that you have to think of all of these things at the same time. You can't really understand why people make the food choices that we do unless you understand how food is produced, processed, distributed, made, sold, and also wasted. So very, very important concept. And I'll say a little bit more about it. One other thing, but it showed up most prominently in the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw that people who had the most severe outcomes from COVID-19, who were the sickest and died, were people who were obese, who had chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, or cardiovascular disease that are related to poor diets, and that obesity, severe outcomes, and chronic diseases were all affected by the same social determinants of health, which are racial and ethnic discrimination, whether you have access to health care, what kind of a place you live in, what your physical environment is like, how much money you have, how much education you have, how much social and community support you have, and of course, your access to healthy food. And so all of these things are joined by access to healthy foods. And that's why my focus is on food. And I'm interested particularly in three relatively new concepts about food. One is food systems, one is triple duty diets, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And the other is ultra processed foods, and I'll also explain about that. But let me say one more word about food systems. This is my favorite food system slide. It's explaining the United States food system at a glance. And this is a Department of Agriculture graph of what happens to the billions of bushels, the 12 billion bushels of corn that are produced in the United States every year. More than 40% of it is used to feed animals. It goes to animal feed. Half of it goes to fuel for automobiles. It feeds automobiles. And less than 10% goes for other food, seed, and industrial uses. So the enormous amount of land that we spend producing corn in the United States has essentially nothing to do with human food. Oh, it has to do with human food through animals and through the meat that we produce. But it's not a production system that is designed for public health or to feed the population. It's designed to feed animals or to produce fuel for automobiles. Get your head around that one. The other, I think, important thing to know about the food system is that it's based on low-wage workers, farmers, fishermen, agricultural workers, workers in meatpacking plants, workers in restaurants. Are among the lowest wage workers in society, and our entire food system depends on them. Something else to keep in mind when we're thinking about this. And then the great irony of the COVID-19 pandemic, as pointed out by the celebrity chef Jose Andres, people of America, he said, I want to talk about two photos that show you what's going on in this country, two painful realities. On the left, the destruction of thousands of pounds of potatoes because there were no distribution systems for those potatoes, and the producers of those potatoes had to throw them away. They couldn't do anything about them. At the same time that cars were lined up for miles in San Antonio outside of a food bank to have handouts of food. And that was the great irony and the great complexity and the great dilemma of the COVID-19 pandemic that showed the ways in which our food system simply doesn't function. And the root causes: a food system driven to maximize profits. As simple as that. Once you understand that the purpose of food companies is to make money for their stockholders, you can understand why the system doesn't work. And a lot of people besides me have written about this, most notably Raj Patel, who has written terrific books about this kind of thing. So that's the food system issue. Let's go on to triple duty diets. So I think it's a very important concept that I don't hear talked about very much, perhaps because it was first put forward in January 2019, just before the pandemic, or a year before the pandemic. And I don't know, these things disappeared without a trace. But there were two reports published in the Lancet. The first was the Eat Lancet report that came out of a committee called the Eat Lancet Committee. And the second one was the Global Syndemic Report, which came out a week later. Two very, very important reports. Let me say something about the Eat Lancet report. First, its question was, how do we feed a future population of 10 billion people and feed them a diet that's going to maximize their health and at the same time keep that diet within planetary boundaries? So it's not producing so much greenhouse gas or destroying the environment so badly that it's unsustainable. That was the question that drove the report. And I won't go through how they did it, but they came out with what they called the planetary health diet, which was a diet that would do three things at once. It would prevent food insecurity, it would prevent obesity and chronic diseases, and it would maximize benefits for the environment and for climate change. And their proposal was to reduce, and their proposal was for diets in high resource countries like the United States to reduce the consumption of meat by about half and to double the amount of plant food. So less meat, more plants in high resource countries. And the reason for the reducing meat by half was because animal-based foods have a much, much greater impact on climate change. The food that has the single greatest impact on climate change is beef, and animal foods in general have a much greater impact on producing greenhouse gases than do plant-based foods, in part because of all the plant-based foods that have to be grown to feed those animals. But that was the rationale in thinking about this. And as they explained, these diets would have triple duty. They would reduce the possibility of obesity and non-communicable diseases because the diets would be healthier and would help prevent obesity and cancer, for example. They would help prevent undernutrition because there would be much more land to grow food for people, and you could grow it more efficiently and sustainably. And it would affect climate change and depress the effect on climate change because there would be less greenhouse gas emission. So triple duty action. The second report, with the unfortunate name of the global syndemic, which a word nobody understands, it means multiple epidemics. That report, I think, was even more important because it did a political analysis. But it too was based on triple duty diets, a diet that would prevent hunger, prevent obesity, and prevent climate change at the same time. And the political analysis rooted the problem in what they called consumptogenic economic systems. I think they meant capitalism, but they didn't say so. I don't know why. So consumptogenic economic systems they defined as economic systems that prioritize corporate economic power, that promote privatization of what used to be public goods, that externalize the health and environmental cost of producing these foods, and that neglect the risks of allowing corporations to have this much power. Capitalist systems, I think. Their analysis went further. The reason that these systems were allowed to exist, that you could have consumptogenic economic systems, was because of policy inertia. There was no policy action for three reasons. Weak governance, that is, government agencies that have been captured by corporations, corporate takeover of government agencies, very powerful food industry opposition to doing anything about it, and weak civic demand for making changes. And the report went on to call for a transformative social movement to overcome that policy inertia. I mean, they were really calling for a revolution, some kind of revolution to transform the system, to strengthen government and to strengthen civil society. And the report had one other thing that I have never seen. in a report of this type, which was they had a roadmap for food industry regulation. They said that governments needed to stop subsidizing food corporations, to stop giving them tax breaks, like allowing them tax breaks for marketing to children, for example. They get to deduct marketing costs from their income taxes, to stop conflicts of interest with corporations, and above all, to stop marketing to children, that practice needed to be stopped. They want the food companies to be required to pay the externalized costs that they were producing, the health and the environmental externalized costs, to keep food industry and food companies out of public policies. They should not have a seat at the policy table because there's an inherent conflict of interest. Make them disclose political donations and hold corporations accountable for what they do. An amazing roadmap, one that I thought was just absolutely astonishing. I'd never seen it before. And here's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In a video saying why corporate capture is the biggest threat to American democracy. He says sock puppets. He referred to federal food agencies as sock puppets, saying they're beholden to corporations. Amazing. But to go back to the Global Syndemic Report, if you restricted commercial influences on federal agencies, you would reduce oppositions to food policies for obesity and non-communicable diseases. You would have reduced corruption and therefore you could have a government that was more concerned about reducing poverty and solving problems of hunger and food insecurity. And you could reduce opposition to climate change. I mean, covers the whole thing. So that's triple duty, diets and dietary advice. I think a very important concept. All right, let me move on to the last thing I want to talk about, which is ultra-processed foods. And I was interested to see that insurance companies who are very, very interested in food as medicine approaches to dealing with patients hardly ever say anything about reducing ultra-processed foods. So let's talk about ultra-processed foods, since they're an item on Kennedy's list also. Ultra-processed foods are a relatively new concept. They were invented in 2009 by Carlos Monteiro and his colleagues at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. And the issue, he said, and his colleagues said in 2009, is food. It's not nutrients. It's not food. It's not nutrients. It's processing. And the trouble with ultra processing is it causes lots of trouble. So the idea of ultra processing was he divided foods into 4 categories: fresh and minimally processed foods, processed culinary ingredients like salt, sugar, fat, salad oils, and so forth, processed foods like those that are canned and frozen and so forth. But then he defined a 4th category of ultra-processed foods, which go way beyond any of those other kinds of processing. All foods are basically processed, but only some are ultra-processed. And the easiest way to look at this is a minimally processed food is corn on the cob. A processed food is canned corn with a little salt added, and an ultra-processed food is Dorito chips with a whole lot of additives. So pretty easy to understand that. You don't care about what the minimally processed, the processed culinary ingredients very much, or the processed foods. What you care about is ultra-processed foods. And their definition is that they're industrially transformed. They don't look anything like the foods that they were made from. They have a lot of color, flavor, and texture additives usually. They're designed to be extremely profitable, and they're designed to be irresistible. addictive, if you prefer. I'm putting it in quotation marks because I'm not quite sure that that's the right word. But there is an increasing amount of evidence that these foods might have addictive properties. At the very least, you can't eat just one, as that old Lay's potato chip commercial talked about. And Michael Moss in his books talked about how food companies deliberately formulated these products to be absolutely irresistible. Okay. The interesting thing about defining ultra-processed foods is that once they're defined, you can do research on them. You can look and see whether people, how much ultra-processed food people are eating, and then you can see what their health is like and what their health outcome is like. And so an enormous amount of research has been done in the last several years. And Carlos Montero and his colleagues have sort of counted up the papers. And from 2009 until the present, well, by 2022, there were 1,600 papers using the word ultra-processed. There are hundreds more by now. They just keep going up and up. And what's interesting about the studies is that they all show the same thing. The degree of consistency in the studies of ultra-processed foods and health is remarkable, absolutely consistent. In 2020, there were 6 systematic reviews on food processing and health outcomes. And there have been many more since then, but they all showed the same thing. An increased risk among people who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods for obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and overall mortality. Okay, these are observational studies. Observational studies can only demonstrate correlation. They do not demonstrate causation. For causation, you need controlled clinical trials. Well, in the case of ultra-processed foods, we have one. We have Kevin Hall's experiment at NIH in 2019, in which Kevin Hall has an interesting deal at NIH. He has a confined metabolic ward. And what's meant by that is he gets volunteers to agree to be locked up for a determined period of time, 4 weeks in this case. And they live in this facility. He gives them diets, in this case, 2 different diets matched in every conceivable way, except one was completely ultra-processed and the other was almost completely not ultra-processed. And the diets were matched in calorie, sugar, fat, fiber. They were matched in flavor. The participants couldn't tell them apart. And then they could eat as much as they wanted of these diets. And at the end of the study, when they were on the ultra-processed diet, they ate 500 calories more a day than when they were on the unprocessed or relatively unprocessed diets, and they did not know it. They didn't realize they were eating more when they were eating the ultra-processed foods. Now, I can't even begin to tell you what a spectacular result this is. 500 calories a day is enormous. It's an enormous difference. If you do dietary comparison, you're lucky if you get a 50-calorie difference. To get a 500-calorie difference is breathtaking. And 500 calories a day means a pound a week. And guess what? They gained a pound a week when they were on the ultra-processed diet. And they lost weight when they were on the unprocessed diet. Now, the big question is why? And Kevin Hall and his colleagues are trying to figure that out. The one thing they noticed was that people ate faster on the ultra-processed diet, but they didn't think that could completely account for it. So they're looking at the caloric density, they're looking at hyperpalatability, that's the addictive qualities. They're looking at various kinds of explanations to try to figure out why. But in the meantime, while they're working on that, a group in Japan repeated the study. And they found an 800 calorie difference. People who were on the ultra processed diet ate 800 calories a day more than when they were on the other diet. I don't think you need to know anything else. Ultra processed foods encourage people to eat more. The implication is obvious. Minimize consumption of ultra processed foods. It's an obvious thing. You don't really need to know anything else. There it is. So, what's happening with ultra processed foods? Well, the food industry is fighting back. Is the America's ultra processed diet that bad? The first thing you do is cast doubt on the research. Big food is fighting back. Processing is beneficial, food companies say. There's no accepted definition of ultra processed foods. It ignores nutrients. If you don't eat ultra processed foods, you won't get enough nutrients, and it excludes healthy foods. On that basis, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has decided not to talk about ultra processed foods in the current version of the dietary guidelines. We'll see. And that's too bad, because the public health environment at the moment is 75% of United States adults are overweight. The leading causes of death and disability in the United States are non-communicable diseases related to diet. There are no national policies except the dietary guidelines designed to address obesity and non-communicable diseases, and it is absolutely not a priority at NIH. Kevin Hall is having trouble getting enough spaces in his metabolic ward to do these studies. And NIH has said its major research priority is precision nutrition, which is individuals' genetic makeup so as to tailor diets to individuals. And I think the answer to this, and the reason for all of this, is that the food industry is strong food industry opposition to anything that's likely to reduce its profits. Ultra-processed foods are an existential threat to the food industry. They pose an existential threat, but they're not the only existential threat. The GLP-1 drugs are also an existential threat. Food companies are saying, don't worry about ultra-processed foods, but the weight loss drugs are making everybody very nervous, because there's already plenty of evidence that people who are on these drugs are not eating as much. Eating less is very bad for business. But besides that, they're preferentially not eating junk food. They're preferentially not eating ultra-processed foods. A third existential threat is inflation. As food prices go up, people don't buy as much. And then the unknown quantity here is RFK Jr., who appears to be taking on the food industry, and particularly around ultra-processed foods and chemicals and other kinds of things that are in them. So what an interesting time this is. And what are we supposed to do about it while all this is going on? Well, I think we go back to Michael Pollan's very simple formulation: eat food, mostly plants, not too much, but modifying the word food to be real food, where real in this situation means not ultra processed. And I think that in this situation, it's good to have a personal agenda. You want to educate people about food, not products. You want to grow food locally and sustainably. Everybody, if you can, grow some food, cook at home, teach kids to cook and garden, and prevent food waste. Those are all things that you can do as an individual that would help the food system a lot. But there's also a much greater food system agenda looking at the big picture here. We want to be, I think, if we want to fix the food system, we have to do something about campaign funding and get money out of politics. We need to refocus our agricultural production system on food for people, not fuel for automobiles or feed for animals. If we're going to do something about hunger and malnutrition and food insecurity, we need a universal basic income. We need universal school meals to make sure that kids are fed. We need major national policies to do something about obesity and non-communicable diseases. I think we need to regulate the food industry, and we need triple duty dietary guidelines. And these are all pie in the sky goals. But if you don't have these kinds of goals, we'll never achieve them. And if we're not working on them, we'll never get them. So we need to be working on it. And then just yesterday or the day before, I saw this Substack article by Michael Moore, who is trying to advise his followers. He's the film director, the working class film director, who's trying to advise his followers how to get through this particular era. And he advises all of us to practice kindness, to read, and by that he means books, to join something. Nothing is more radical than belonging to groups, to get real news, to take care of yourself, because if you're not taken care of, you can't do the work that you need to do. Pledge to stand for something, have values, live by those values, and do good for those who have the least. I thought this was lovely. I really, really liked it. So I'm greatly in favor of advocating for all of those things. I think the most important thing all of us can do is to learn how to be really effective advocates and advocate for what we believe in. And I will leave you with that thought and say, vote with your fork. Even better, vote with your vote. I hope, when we get a chance to vote again, vote. And I thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity to share these comments with you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Marion, for all of those helpful and informative comments. And I hope we have a little time for questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, sure.
It's up to you if you have questions that you want to ask.
Okay, so somebody's going to have to read it, and I'm going to need, and somebody needs to shout.
Yes, I'll make sure I repeat the question.
Let me get rid of that.
You want to keep an eye on any webinar questions. Okay, questions. Dan, please.
Yeah. I appreciated the point about well the triple.
I'm not going to be able to hear.
I'm sorry, the triple duty diets. Can you hear me?
No.
About the triple duty diets.
Why don't you just repeat the question?
Yeah.
I'll repeat the question.
And when you're talking about the climate effect of different foods, but can you talk about the difference between the feedlot beef and locally grown grass-fed beef?
Okay, so on triple duty diets and the climate effect, the difference between feedlot beef and local grass-fed beef.
Well, for one thing, if you're doing grass-fed, there are a lot fewer animals. Therefore, they're going to have a lot less climate impact. One of the things that impresses me about the environmental evaluations of food production is I can almost predict who did the evaluating by what the result is. There is no commonly agreed upon set of criteria for environmental evaluation. And until we have that, it's very difficult to do comparisons. But for sure, in the case of grass-fed beef, you're not growing corn and soybeans to feed cattle. So you've got that taken care of right there. And if you've got cattle wandering around on grassland, you don't have nearly as many of them as you have in feedlots. So you're going to have a climate advantage right there.
Yeah, go ahead.
She commented on the hydroponics and aquaculture.
Okay, and a question about hydroponics and aquaponics.
Oh dear, they're going out of business right and left. It's turning out not to be, certainly the ones that are indoor and require enormous amounts of electricity are not doing very well, and they're closing one after another. It makes me really sad. I was fond of Aerofarm. Um, the outside ones, if they use sunlight, they have a chance of succeeding much more. I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, I think, do they have a place in this food future that you're imagining?
Sure they do.
Yeah.
Sure they do. If you're in a place where you're not living in farmland, and you can do it in indoor facilities or you can do it in cities, then it has a place. How big a place is a real question.
Mhm.
And that I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I mean, I grow food on my terrace in Manhattan, but that's not going to solve food problems. It's not going to solve hunger problems for the world, although it sure is fun.
Some have suggested that they're nutritionally deficient.
Oh, I guess the question was about nutrition. So are those hydroponic foods nutritionally deficient compared to ones grown in soil?
Depends on what they're given.
Mm.
It
Not
depends
necessarily.
totally on what they're given. From what I understand of the well, they weren't exactly hydroponic, the aerofarm stuff, but plants make their own vitamins. So you don't have to worry about vitamins if the plants are growing because they make their own. So the question is minerals. They'll make their own antioxidants, they'll make their own vitamins, they'll make their own flavor components, they'll make their own pigments. So the question is minerals, and that depends on what they're fed. To the extent that they're done well, certainly the nutritional evaluations that have been done of some of the hydroponic and indoor growing vegetable things show that they had equivalent nutritional value to those grown in soil, but they're only looking at what they're measuring. You don't know about the stuff they're not measuring. And you would think that plants grown in soil, especially if the soils are good, would have much more, but nobody's really doing those measurements that I know.
Okay. Yeah, Amanda, I saw your hand.
So over the past year, there was a lot of confrontation by farmers with their government in France. Like I like to kind of keep track of what's going on in other governments around the world. And so on the topic of food politics, is there a governing body or country's government that she looks to as being really at the front edge of managing this better?
All right, so thinking about the protests in France this summer, farmers protesting, wondering if there's a world power that you look to that's doing this well, that's doing this food policy well.
I'm going to confess ignorance. I mean, countries are complicated, and there are pieces in countries where they're trying to do it better, but I can't think of anyone that is sort of has the kind of thing that you would look up to and everybody would go visit. It's always little pieces within countries that are doing it really well, and we have little pieces within the United States that are doing fabulous work. The people who are doing regenerative agriculture are doing great jobs. The question is, how do you scale it up? How do you get everybody else to do it? And at some point, you hope that the government will support these kinds of things better than it has in the past. That's something to work for and to push for.
I saw a question here, yes.
You mentioned that there isn't a generally accepted definition of ultra-processed foods. What is your specific definition?
So we don't have a general definition for ultra-processed foods, but what's your definition of ultra-processed foods?
You can't make it in your home kitchen. If you can make it in your own kitchen, it's not ultra processed. That means you can buy the ingredients. I make ice cream at home. It's not ultra processed. It's got 4 ingredients. You can make potato chips at home. You can make lots of junk foods at home, but they're not ultra processed. It's the ones that have the ingredients in them that you cannot get because they're not sold at grocery stores. They're industrial ingredients. I suppose you could get them if you know, wrote away for them or ordered them from some industrial place. But that's an operating definition that I think works pretty well.
Great. Other question?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
About the upcoming book.
Yes, can you tell us more about your upcoming book? The What to Eat Now book? Yes.
Well, I'm doing a new edition of my book, What to Eat, which came out in 2006. And that was an analysis of food issues that come up in grocery stores. So I used grocery stores as an organizing device and went around it. And then in every section of the grocery store, I talked about what the issues were, the nutritional issues, the environmental issues, the labor issues, every issue I could think of. And then for the new edition, I'm laughing because it was so much work. I thought that it would be a 6-month project and I could just kind of whip it off. And 3 years later, I turned in this ridiculous manuscript, and it'll come out late in 2025. It's just going into copy editing now, but it'll be a big book and it talks about current issues, you know, from the nutritional to what happens to human rights observers on fishing vessels out at sea. I mean, I tried to cover everything that I thought was really important. And there's going to be a spin-off book from that. They took the fish chapters out of their 5 fish chapters. They took those chapters and made them into a separate book called The Fish Counter. It'll be a very small book in a series of 6 books on oceans. And that will come out sometime next year also. And then I'm working for the following year. I've collected cereal boxes for years, and I'm doing a book with a co-author on the history of food and nutrition policy in the United States using cereal boxes as illustrations.
Fascinating. Wow.
So this is a fun project.
Great. I'm glad to hear it. Let me start down at the end, please.
If it can be determined, what are these other things that you can counter for plants or, you know, processed versus unprocessed, besides the vitamins and the minerals? And they said the other thing, the other most important elements they're not counting.
Right.
And we can never determine what those are.
So in terms of judging the nutritional value of, say, aquaponic plants versus soil-grown plants. Oh, ultra-processed. So
Non-processed foods.
what are the things we need to look for? What are the things we need to measure that we can't measure yet in ultra-processed foods?
Or versus the, right now we're just doing vitamins and minerals,
Right.
what I understood, and they're saying they're the same or something.
So we're measuring vitamins and minerals in terms of the value. What else are what are we not measuring that we need to measure to determine the,
Sure that, you know, if you follow Michael Pollan's principles and eat a variety of relatively unprocessed foods, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You know, the vitamins will take care of themselves. The minerals will take care of themselves.
I mean, I'm sorry, I mean
You know, Americans are not vitamin deprived. So I'm not sure what the question means exactly. I mean, the Department of Agriculture does elaborate nutritional analyses of a very large number of foods. You can go online, you look for food composition database and type in the name of the food and up it will pop. The website's a little tricky to use because you have to know which button to click on, but it's not that hard and you can figure it out pretty easily. And you can get the most elaborate nutritional information for an enormous number of products, specific fatty acids, specific amino acids. You know, why do you want to know that? I'm not,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, I think it's scientifically interesting, but I'm not sure why you want to know it. And
she said,
but you know, I would like to know the environmental cost of these things. I'd like to know that a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm really distressed that there hasn't been a consensus meeting on how do we measure environmental impact. I think we need one very badly. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to read them, because if you look at comparative studies, and it's kind of a joke. If the company that made the product did the environmental analysis, then it's going to show that it had no environmental impact at all. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but that I think that's a huge gap. I don't think nutrients are a gap. We know how to
Let me
do
take one more
we know how
question,
to do
Jamie.
that.
Oh,
Yeah, let me take one more question.
You said, you were saying in your speech before, in your information, that you said, all they're measuring is vitamins and minerals. They're not measuring these other very valuable things. In the food comparison between the hyper-processed and the non-processed foods. So the hyper-processed food industry is using the fact that there's not enough information to make its own case against.
So I guess in the comparison that you were talking about between ultra-processed and non-processed foods, that the companies that make ultra-processed foods are saying they only measure nutrients. And you were saying there's other things that could be measured to make the argument against.
No, that was with respect to hydroponics.
Okay.
Oh, it was.
The hydroponic, if you're looking at hydroponics, then they measure a certain number of nutrients. They don't measure them all.
Right. Right.
But for ultra-processed foods, the formulation has to do with sugar, salt, fat, flavors, colors. One of the reasons why the cereal companies don't want to take the bright colors out of kids' cereals is that people complain the cereals don't taste as good if the colors are gone. So that's about a psychological kind of thing. And the formulation of products that you can't stop eating have to do with appearance, taste, odor, flavor, and texture. And those combinations, those are carefully researched. I mean, as Michael Moss discusses in his book, nobody puts out a product that doesn't go through consumer testing in advance. And the winning products are those that people can't stop eating.
And they have these.
I'm not sure that answers your question.
No, I think you did. Thank you. So I'm going to let one more question. Jamie, you had your hand up.
So I'm curious about the use of the terms overweight and obesity as definitions, because it comes from the BMI. The BMI is just two measures of height and weight, and it was developed just on white men. And it's used a lot in food and health research, obesity and overweight and BMI. And I'm curious if you think this is something that public health is sticking with, or if there's other measures that can also be used to demonstrate.
So the terms obesity and overweight were based on BMI, which was a study done on white men. Am I getting that right? And so does public health have another way of looking at, or another way of formulating that? Yeah.
I mean, the fight over the BMI it's a really imperfect measure, but it's not a bad starting place. Then you have to be more individual about what it means for individuals. I mean, a lot of people are talking about waist hip circumference. And so I just saw one where how round you are, a roundness index. So people are looking at those. The waist hip has been around for a long time. But it's not, I don't know. The thing about the BMI is it's really easy to measure in population studies. So you can get a lot of data from a lot of people. And that's how it got, it got started never as a measure for obesity. It got started as a measure for undernutrition in populations. It was meant to find out whether it was meant to be a population, never an individual measure. It was a population measure to show undernutrition and the risk of malnutrition in societies. And then it got used as an obesity measure later on inappropriately for individuals. Not bad for populations, but inappropriate for individuals. And a lot of people have been hurt by it. And that's, I think, extremely unfortunate. But I don't know anything better at the time, at this moment. For individuals, yes, they're easier. You can do waist hip. But for populations, I don't know anybody doing anything better than that.
Well, unfortunately, we run out of time, but I want to thank you very much, Marion, for all of your comments, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Wish I could be there. Sorry.
Well, we wanted you in person. And that's it for ThinkFOOD for this year. Thank you all for coming, and we'll hope to see you next time. Thank you very much. Have a good day.